So our second presenter today is Guinevere Clark from Swansea University. She's going to present the Poetics of Birth as initiation into third space. And if I'm correct, we have some of your own poems that we're going to be listening today. Is that correct? Okay, so it's off to you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'll share my screen now, and hopefully this will all function. But thank you, Dr. Hennessey, for letting me speak at this symposium. It's really exciting to me to share some of my PhD work. So I'm Dr. Guinevere Clark, and I graduated from Swansea University in 2023 with the Egg in the Triangle, Poetics of Sexuality, Motherhood, Sexuality and Place. Correct, I'll be sharing my own poetry because I did a creative writing PhD. So I'm here to share some of that on the Poetics of Birth as initiation into third space. So a little bit about myself and my research. So I wrote this as a cisgender woman, written from lived experience of motherhood, pregnancy, as a kind of living theory, wherein in living theory, the research involves the individual generating their own unique explanations rather than deducing from general theories. So we'll come to that later, and how I formed an analysis model formed from what I describe as third space of motherhood. I also had a background experience of domestic abuse and birth trauma that influenced a lot of my creative writing and my journey, my living theory journey through my PhD. And I ended up writing a lot of my work on single parenting, which allowed me to touch into gender inequality, sexual politics, and things like that. My son is called Sol. So when we talk about initiation, so obviously the Poetics of Birth as initiation into third space is what I'm here to talk about today. What we mean by that is that little bit as to what Ariana was talking about at the end about that permeability, did she say, lyrical permeability between the reader and the writer, but the poetry is a means to initiate the reader into the subject vicariously, as well as to encapsulate that experience of pregnancy and motherhood as the experience from the mother. So that led to an interest, really, the idea of initiation into rites of passage and liminality, and birth is expressing that, and the interplay of opposites, so within liminality being between two things. And it became important during my PhD. So creative writing PhD, anyone that's doing that or knows about it, you form a body of creative work, and then there's a whole analysis around that body of creative work. So as part of my analysis, I wanted to create a model that showed the multivalence of motherhood. It's not singly defined, but also it's a very specific and concentrated experience with far-reaching aesthetics. So I flanked motherhood with sexuality in place on my model, which I'll show you shortly. And as I say, that allowed me to expand my study and look at gender and also the body and being in place and what that means in terms of each poem and the experience shared within each poem. And eventually, which really is a comment on the fact that matricentric feminism isn't as widely available or known as it should be, I discovered quite towards the end of my PhD, matricentric feminism, which is a feminism for mothers developed by Andrew O'Reilly, which really empowered my work. So as I say, liminality became a very strong interest of mine. What is it? You probably know a bit about it already, but what I took from it is it's about experience, and it's about transition. It's not a theory. It's about something that happened, something that is. Took me back into looking at where the word came from, into anthropological theory and the work of Arnold van Gennep and Victor Turner. And they studied liminality and broke it down into 3 phases. You can see those phases here. So the rites of passage that often involve liminality. So we can see birth as a rite of passage from one state to the next. And we have the separation, then the transitional phase, which is the liminal phase, and then the post-liminal or the incorporation phase. So that's the area that I zoned in on for my PhD. And as women, if you look at the end part of this quote, we are very accustomed to change and changeable terrain. And, you know, as matricentric feminism empowered my work, so did the idea of living in this in-between state and being, you know, knowledgeable of what it is to live in between as a mother and as a, you know, a mother that's going through childbearing or birth. So I started to put these ideas down, and it's very simple. It just is a very rudimentary Venn diagram where I started to pull out that in-between space, so the third space between the mother and the child. It is a fused space, a place of natural interplay between the two, of experience, and it's made manifest through the mothering role. I think that's what's really important, is that motherhood will initiate this new space, which we all know about, of course, if we've been through it, but it's just another way to define it and look at it. Third space I see is often perceived as invisible or challenging, or it's a prescribed space sometimes, that can be seen as limiting. But what I wanted to do is deepen the access and awareness and the expressions in between space through poetry and my analysis model. So there's a little bit more here on the idea of, again, which Ariana looked at in her presentation, about that in-between space with the interstitial space. Nothing is necessarily ruling. Third space defines sovereignty, and it can be about that struggle for discourse or dominance. And I just became very interested in the multivalence of motherhood and that living in between dichotomies. And that became the kind of key into so much of my analysis. Poems I'd already written and then went on to write. Some of the feminists, the French feminist Cizot, she talks a lot about binaries and deconstructing binaries, and it being really important to do that. So these aren't defined, these are to deconstruct. So this is just a simple list of things I started to notice that existed in third space, as in, you know, being able to function perhaps in one world, maybe a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday prior to giving birth, and then almost becoming dysfunctional in that world to a certain extent, about, you know, maybe being very much in the public domain and then having to retreat more into the domestic or private domain, the fullness of pregnancy as opposed to the emptiness of having given birth. There's something is missing, something new as a kid, but something's missing. And just the dichotomy of male, female, night, day. It became endless, as you can see. The lists kept on coming, and I kept on writing poetry, and it became this, one of the phrases that really struck me was this epistemic tussle. in my research of liminal and third space. and the in-between, living in the in-between was this epistemic tussle, and I just loved that quote. And it became rich poetic ground to analyse my own poetry, but also the poetry of other mothers. I looked at Sharon Olds, Liz Berry, and if we return now to third space, the third space, if you remember that Venn diagram, wasn't too long ago, that in-between space, and I used poetry as a route, as I say, to become empowered and to also celebrate and document my pregnancy, birth, and early years of mothering within these aspects of third space. If we define what that area is, and of course it's individual to each woman, but it is specific to each woman. I believe this is universal, and we can't deny the relationship that happens and the interplay that happens. And I talk a bit in my PhD that even if a child is lost in abortion or adopted out or other tragedy with death, or the woman, it always exists. The mother always has existed and exists in third space. So it's a very concentrated space. It's specific, it's gendered, it's an intense space sometimes. And it involves learning, change, rediscovery, and this interplay. So during my PhD, I became very, very tired. It took me 7 years of the oppositional interplay was all I seemed to think about and talk about for 7 years. So that third space became the egg space of my model. So bear with me. You can see now, I'd identified a very definite space, nothing that, is perhaps, rocket science, but it was important for me to say what's happening in that space. Actually, a lot of conflict, a lot of being in between things, in between the changing processes of the child or my own identity and all of the other things that I've listed. So I created this model, as I said earlier. I've flanked motherhood with sexuality in place because they became really evident in what I was writing about creatively. Expanded my research. And that third space became the symbolic egg. So any poem can be put into this egg space. So it's an analytical space. One, the Maud poem, Under Maud Moon, we can put that in there. We can put any poem in there. And what we're looking at is the oppositional interplay of those binaries and what is to be found when we start to deconstruct limiting binaries, good, bad, virgin, whore, all of those things that circulate in the culture of motherhood and the media representations of motherhood as well, and sometimes the literary representations or myth representations or non-representations. So those arrows, they represent the flow, the interplay of the opposites. And as Ariana also was discussing about the porous nature within some texts, and that egg is classically porous, isn't it? It has to be able to receive and breathe on the in and the out, but it's protected, it's time sensitive as well, and there's a durability to it. So using this as, again, the triangle, ancient symbol of the womb and femininity, water, I just found that I could hang all of my ideas, because I had lots of them, onto this model. So I'll move on now to two poems that I wrote. One, I Had a Baby, which I'll read first. And just to remind you that the model is aimed to assist the literary exploration of the maternal. It derived from maternal experience and my own epistemic experiences, especially useful for creative writing. But it can really be applied to any discipline, and you can put anything on the edge of that. I always suggest keeping motherhood there, but you can add different things to it, media and politics, or, history or midwifery. And this just helps to raise contextual awareness when we flank motherhood with other major subject arenas. It helps look at mother's voice, our epistemic representation, the subject and the culture around us. So I do have some poems which I think Anna was going to put in the chat. Is that okay? So this one, I had a baby, turned into a fetus, threw my legs to the sulk of bulk, slow mend of purple muscle. Nothing to say from these thinned teeth, gaps in bone on that funereal drive home, unslept, undressed, kicking through the rift, hard flesh of you, lover, elbowed from this kiss. So that's a poem that explores, if I use my analysis model and some of my research influences, very much focuses on the mother's experience. There's a triad in there of mother, baby, lover / father, but there's a little vagueness too within the poem, like who's kicking through who through the rift. Is it the mother to the father to the mother, the baby? We all know the baby's kick. There can be a violence around that kind of feisty newborn. And typical in liminal space is vagueness or ambiguity, which is an interesting thing, fuzzy or grey space, where we have that tussle between sovereignty, what is, what isn't. And then very physical place of the body, legs, muscles, bone, flesh, teeth, the kiss. So a very visceral poem, sparseness in form. So we have that intensity, less than 50 words, but quite a lot portrayed. So in terms of the epistemic tussles, we can break that down, and what is between that tenderness of the newborn experience and then violence that might be surrounding that experience, whether that's domestic abuse or as I say, that very physical nature of the baby. So that comes to play in the poem, an interplay between birth and death as well, with the word funereal, drive home, which, to be honest, was the absolute truth. It was a cold, scary journey home. And that's where, when we write from lived experience, we can find that kind of power, if you like, within our language. The mother reverts into the fetus to start with. So we have the oppositional interplay of regression rather than the progression of growth, and a very clear return for the mother into a different state herself, which highlights birth as transformative and challenging. So I'll move on to my next poem, and this one's called Mothering Under the Mandala. Okay. Oh, I can see someone said about the mandala's actually downstairs. I just moved and I saw it on the kitchen table earlier. I will post it to a group at some point. So, Mothering Under the Mandala. You were still an egg in the cave of my pelvis when I carefully packed the mandala, still smelling of ink and market figs, into my suitcase. The Bosphorus unravelled beneath as we flew from Istanbul in the sweat of dance and travel. And now, tiny sun, you shimmer under the sheer pink fabric, fixed in a square of light, a Welsh dawn rippling the kaleidoscope of your eyes. On the loom of our universe, it stretches wide, pinned over the bed, behind it all a web, knots, pauses, the scaffold of beauty, the star in making, sun of somebody else's morning, sewn with thick gold thread on this dot to dot. You are the matrix, and we need no pages, no more planes, no more world travel. You are the adventure now. Elated, peach bright in your crochet, smiling beyond the edges of your smile. Amaze me again. Now I understand creation. We are this pattern, unstitched, stitched from the rota of life for a while, relishing the definition of our faces, fresh from the tumble of milk-hashed sleep. And we drift into the shape of our day, lights of the world threading through our window. I nurse the purple stub of umbilicus you gifted me, rattle the specimen bottle, no fat placenta for the apple tree, but enough for me, oozing, half drunk from you, arching into my capable breast, struck with needle-thin scratches. So with that poem, it's more of a narrative poem. We have the language obviously drawing on the metaphor as woman as creatrix in the process of creating to enable manifestation, the loom, the stitching, the sewing, the knot. And again, birth as direct change. There's no more world travel. You are the adventure now. There's a big opposition between the wider world and the smaller, more domestic world. So there's a journey, very typical in liminal space, that transition. And again, very physical with the breath, the eyes, that visceral world, the umbilicus, the places of our creation when we're making babies. And a rite of passage referenced really through the rituals of the burying the placenta, which didn't happen in my case because I was a crash C-section, and the gift of the umbilicus. Oppositional interplay, seen, unseen, the freedom and the restriction. And it isn't saying either way what's good, what's bad, we have the joy of the travel as much as the joy of the breastfeeding. And that's where, coming in between these binaries and using third space, we can celebrate, we can document, we can explore what's actually happening in our place with our child, our baby, our body, and day and night often coming in, and the in-between spaces of dawn and dusk, which again are liminal spaces, liminal times. So that's me in terms of my presentation. Thank you for listening. I do have some references at the end of this PowerPoint, and I can absolutely send it to anyone that's interested. Just some books that I found really interesting throughout my research, and some direct quotes I've taken from some of these as well.